If there is hope, it lies in the Proles. George Orwell.
So where is prole drift the most common? Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick and part 3 on my analysis of prole drift, which is becoming a deeper rabbit hole than I ever thought I would get into. Where is this actually taking place? How is it showing up on a macro institutional level? I gave you several examples in the first two parts of this series. Now I'm going to go zoom back out the 30,000 foot view and explain where is this visible and why it's happening. And the answer is kind of a two-edged sword. Prole drift is more visible in the United States because the free market adapts to the sensibilities of prole drift by providing goods and services that reflect that value quicker than a more regulated society such as in Europe. But the idea of prole drift is more embedded within European society because what an American would perceive as prole drift is perceived as normal everyday life. I mean, if you want to know more about this, watch my video, The Myth of European Social Equality, where I break down that a lot of the social mobility and low Gini coefficients in Europe are misleading. Outside of the old money establishment families, everybody's kind of at the same level, whether they're in the top quintile or the bottom quintile. It covers up a lot of the hidden wealth that is more common in Europe, and whereas the overwhelmingly majority of the population would be considered lower middle class by American standards, a much lower floor, but you also have a much larger upper middle class and lower upper class cohorts and those who can generationally move upward. The gaps are more visible because among the visible classes, there is a much wider variance. In Europe, the visible class is pretty close together in terms of their living standards and the way they live and their incomes. But the invisible class that really isn't seen is kind of a whole world away. Why is it more evident? One, I just think because American culture is more dominant in global media. So a lot of the ideologies of prole drift and the ideological branding of it has come through American media. The idea of pushing the idea of gig work as freedom, renting forever as minimalism, no kids as child-free, no cars as walkability, or skepticism of like the education system as just being like awakened and understanding the real truth versus the fact that you just couldn't make it into those academic institutions. They're better at branding. A lot of the middle class markers such as pensions, homeownership, marriage, going to college without debt, and a comfortable retirement are becoming less reachable for a large chunk of the population. You have the rise of streetwear, thrifting, and other hipsterized manifestations of previously like lower class behavior is more of an American thing that has been exported elsewhere. And they rebrand like their precarious state as more of an authenticity. However, the difference is that people in America still view a lot of this adjustment as more of a temporary thing than a permanent thing. The most notable example of the contrast in visibility of prole drift in the US versus Europe is through vehicles and what kind of cars you see on the road. The biggest prole drift examples that come through terms of transportation are noisy vehicles generally. And I mean noisy on purpose, not noisy just because they're old, or lifted trucks. The origin of these intentionally noisy vehicles was from working class car culture. The noise became a performative symbol of like, yeah, my car has more horsepower, it's stronger, and therefore I have increased machismo. As technology has improved with cars, a stronger, more powerful muscle car or a car with more horsepower doesn't necessarily have to make any noise, especially in terms of EVs. But the signal of and the sense of power from having an exceptionally noisy car and making you sound like a cool, tough guy still pervaded in working class culture and has since moved up as a sign of prole drift to a lot of middle class people who have the same sentiment. And on the other side is lifted trucks. There's originally a purpose for lifted trucks, particularly in rural areas where you have to drive through mud or more hilly terrain or off-road. there was a real reason for rural and blue collar trades to need a more elevated truck. But now it's kind of coded as a working class power and status symbol, like the noisiness of the car. And so now you're starting to see a lot of people who would otherwise be middle class suburban people who, instead of using this money for more traditionally elite coded cars, such as high end luxury cars, are now using it for lifted trucks. Even though driving a lifted truck in a big city or the suburb makes no practical sense, they take up way too much space in the parking lot. They hardly ever use it for the practical and original intention for having lifted truck, and has now become more of a Prole drift example. And in fact, I think it's the strongest Prole drift example in all of transportation in the United States. There's still social mobility and the ethos in enough of the population, which might be changing, but for now, enough people aim and try to move up. You have a dynamic economy that's still growing. Maybe it's just more visible, but it's not ingrained into the culture and institutions. The government is not built around everybody being a precariat in the United States. Whereas in Europe, it's more institutionalized. There's more wage compression in Europe, whether due to a larger portion of the economy owned by the state, which has fixed wages, or the fact that everybody has a similar level of education and qualifications. In Europe, at least more so than in the United States, we have more extreme variance in people's skill sets and education levels. They also may have to do with high taxes and high social safety nets. So even if there was more variance in pre-tax income, the variance in post-tax income after benefits paid is very flat compared to the United States. There really isn't much of a bourgeoisie upper middle class, or if they are, they often move to other places. A lot of the wealth is more old and established money, and they keep a very low profile. So it's simply not as visible. Like a lot of common Prole drift ideas, such as biking instead of driving a car, or normcore fashion, cohabitation instead of marriage, low birth rates, anti-home ownership, no air conditioning, are just kind of not viewed as like a drift downward, but just as a normal part of life, because the drift downward already happened and they just didn't take the certain step up that the US did over the last 25 years or so. The fact that it's also been institutionalized in the legal system. For example, cohabitation rights are much stronger in Europe. So even if you don't get married, you get a lot of the marriage benefits just by living with somebody for more than a certain amount of time. The welfare state softens poverty, but it also has the cost of more economic stagnation, whether that's direct welfare for the disadvantaged or more generous pensions, which I'm going to talk about in my economic features of Europe. In Italy, the average Italian retiree gets 70% of their old income in pensions, where it's 30 to 40% for an American at the same income bracket level. And they have higher levels of youth unemployment, people living with their parents until their late 30s and 40s in many of these countries, and a lot of them having more of a state of permanent renterhood means that it's more established and systemic. Not really blamed on an individual's life choices or bad planning. It's just the way it is. Well, anti-materialism and slow living is a byproduct of lower living standards and less achievement relative to other countries such as East Asia and the United States, which are experiencing much faster growth rates, but not willing to accept that maybe there's something wrong with their society and the way it operates, but they have different and better priorities. That's kind of different. America's more loud and it's more obvious, but in Europe, it's just kind of become more universal. And I think it just has to do with the way the class structures are different. The American class structure is many more classes and a lot more fluidity between them. The European class structure is more stagnant and there are fewer levels you can move to, and it's not really generational. And you see this an example, not just in economic, but in terms of the social signs of pro drift. Like you would say, like example, like the back to tattoos, like the rates of tattoos in countries like Sweden, Italy, Germany, and the UK are considerably higher than the United States for millennials and Gen Z. You also see more normalization of living with parents to an older age and a variety of other things. The one place in the developed world where you don't see Prole drift is in East Asia, I think that's also partially because GDP per capita have been consistently rising in East Asia and rising very quickly since the 1960s, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, China, and a lot of ASEAN countries, and more recently India. The fact that you have the economy really growing and GDP per capita really growing for the most part. Like Japan has seen a little bit of prole drift with the reader and neat culture, hikikomoris, and people living with parents longer and not having families. And it's starting to impact Korea too. So it's not that these cultures are superior in any way. Prole drift, it's more that a society where incomes and living standards are consistently growing, especially for the middle and working classes, the less prole drift and more aspirational behavior. Whereas societies that do not, or are starting to turn the other way, seem to have more prole drift. And you just generally have more segregation among elites in East Asia. You also have social capital tied more to external achievements. You don't only have the flexibility just to create your own lifestyle and say, I'm happy the way I am if I don't achieve the traditional metrics. That's generally more frowned upon. And there's more of a shame-based culture and a value for meritocracy. I'm not saying these are necessarily a good thing. A lot of them are taken too far, and that's why you have things like the tiger mom stereotype. But it is an example of one part of the world which has seen less prole drift. It's not even immune. If you've seen recent trends in Japan, since their economy started to stagnate in the 90s. So it's really just a byproduct of where living standards are rising versus where living standards are falling. Let me know what your thoughts are on prole drift. And if you want to go more into a video maybe about how to avoid prole drift and try to maintain your standards or increase your standards in a world of lowering standards. And if you like this kind of content, feel free to share, like, and subscribe.